So, welcome back again. In the previous video, I stopped in line number 75. Let me continue the video series from line number 76. Then he says, "Through your eye twinkles steel. You shake your head. Mine is shaped a monk. You say the sting is in that. If Master of Cosimo announced himself, mum's the word naturally, but a monk. Come, what am I a beast for? Tell us now." So, together with justifying his actions again, he is repeatedly trying to justify his action. He accuses the city guards of prejudices towards monks. According to him, it is merely his being a monk that got him in this embarrassing situation. He questions the city guards whether they react as consequently as they do now if they encountered his master Cosimo of the Medici in the same situation. Fra Lippo Lippi is convinced of the fact that his master could get off much easier than he can. He wants to bond in one way or another with the guards and tries this by singling out one of them. "Come, what am I a beast for? Tell us now." When he invites one of them to answer his question, he adds "tell us now" to his request. So, this is a subtle way to single out one of his interlocutors, that means the night guards, and make it seem as if the others are on the monk's side and disagree with their colleague. So, from now on, from line number 89, Fra Lippo would talk about his past life. He says, "I was a baby when my mother died and father died and left me in the street. I starved there, God knows how, a year or two on fig skins, melon parings, reams and sharks, refuse and rubbish." So now Fra Lippo starts justifying his actions, drawing upon his irregular childhood. To describe this horrible situation, he uses a paradox. "I starved there, God knows, a year or two on figs, skins, melon, parings, reins, and shucks." In line number 83, Fra Lippo expresses his own vivacity as to how he survived those years and introduces the divine authority. God knows how. So, by introducing God, he may add force to his monologue and make his previous social position look even worse while he is wallowing in the role of victim. Additionally, we see the use of word refuse and ravish. The repetition of both the R sound and the F sound expresses the human lips rattling because of the cold. And then he says, "Old aunt, sorry, one fine frosty day, my stomach being empty as your hat, the wind doubled me up and down I went. Old Aunt Lapacia thrust me with one hand. Its fellow was a stringer as I knew, and so along the wall over the bridge, by the straight cut to the convent." To describe his nutritious situation, he uses a comparison that is in contrast with his intention to conciliate the city guards. He says, my stomach being empty as your hat. Saying that one's hat is empty is the same as calling that person stupid. So let me tell you an interesting thing that in Middle Ages there was a trend that child was forcibly ovulated to the convent. That means the poor child were forcibly led to convent to to pursue a monk life. So he said that he had come through his aunt Lapacia. At the age of 8, he was laid in this place. Later on, he says, by the straight cut to the convent. 6 was there while I stood munching my first bread that month. So, boy, you are minded, quoth the good fat father, wiping his own mother. It was refection time to quit this very miserable world. Will you renounce the mouthful of bread? Thought I. So here, a prior of head of the convent questions Fra Lippo Lippi that can you quit the terms and conditions of the miserable world? That means, can you renounce the earthly things? But as he was a child, he thought that the man is talking about the bread. So he later says, by no means brief, they made a monk of me. I did renounce the world, its pride and greed. Palace, farm, villa, shop, and banking house, trash, such as these poor devils of Medici have given their hearts to all at 8 years old. So he's talking about how he had to renounce the world at 8 years. The implicit meaning contributes to his justification because he had to renounce the world at 8 years old. He now turns to earthly pleasures. He's trying to put the situation into perspective. It seems as if he's playing his own advocate in a law case, and his plea draws upon his hard and destructive youth. The monk, there is no denying the fact that the monk is referring to his current master in a negative way as he utters trash, such as these poor devils of Medici. Obviously, considering the wealth of the Medici, poor is to be understood metaphorically. Okay. Denominating his family with devils, the monk is quite harsh for his machiness, although the choice of words is not necessarily arbitrary, since Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's grandson, was often associated with the devil. So, after criticizing his master, Cosimo of Medici, he now would talk about the advantages of monastery. So he says, well, sir, I found in time, you may be sure, it was not for nothing. The good bellyful, the warm surge, and the rope that goes all around, and day long blessed idleness beside. Let us see what the urchins fit for that came next. Not overmuch their way, I must confess. So he is talking about the advantages of the monastery, and in doing so, the monk uses a litotes or a double negation. He says, It was not for nothing the good bellyful. He mentions the food, the clothing, and the idleness. This is something that he was not used to and therefore appreciated even more. Hence, he describes it using letotes to trace the positive sides by a double negation. During the description of his youth and how he ended up in the monastery, he does not use a lot of images. There may be a good reason to use this clean cut language, namely that he wants his interlocutor, that means the night guard, to understand him completely. He is very carefully choosing his words to make sure that his interlocutor grasps every aspect of what he is saying. He wants to clarify his situation and thus excuse himself. This is the key note Fra Lippo Lippi is struggling with. He wants to clarify his situation and thus excuse himself. Then he says, such a to do. They tried me with their books. They tried me with their books. Lord, that have taught me Latin in pure West. Flower of the clove, all the Latin I construe is amo, I love. He's talking about how the monks tried to teach him Latin, but it went in vain. Because of his cruel experiences in the streets, he learned to read people's faces and to distinguish helpful people from those who judged him because of his situation. But mind you, when a boy stubs in the streets 8 years together, as my fortune was, watching folks' faces to know who will fling the beat of half-stripped grave bunch he desires, and who will curse or kick him for his pains, who is gentleman, processional and fine, holding a candle to the sacrament, will wink and let him lift a plate and catch the droppings of the wax to sell again, or who'll further eat and have him wifed. How say I? So from line 114 to 122, he brings this across through some vivid descriptions. This all feeds into his description of young Fra Lippo Lippi, who, instead of what the monks tried to teach him, wanted to draw and paint. So he was fond of drawing and painting. He also says, nay, which dog bites, which lets drop his bone from the heap of oval in the street. Why, soul and sense of him grow sharp alike. He learns the look of things, and none the less for admonition from the hunger pinch. So here he elaborates that when he was child, he somehow learned to read people's faces and the surrounding of the streets so pinpointedly. Then he says, I had a store of such remarks, be sure, which after I found leisure turned to use. I drew men's faces on my copybooks, as I have said few minutes back, that he was fond of drawing and painting. So in leisure time, he drew men's faces on his copybooks, scrawled them within the antiphonary merge, joined legs and arms to the long music notes, found eyes and nose and chin for A's and B's, and made a string of pictures of the world betwixt the ins and outs of verb and noun, on the wall, the bench, the door. So basically, here he illustrated that he used to draw his painting in the antiphonary merge. Let me tell you, the antiphonary is the so called service book where in the Middle Ages some vulgar, some naughty illustration was there, as for example, two guards who were sleeping, a man picking his nose, etc. Anyway, what follows the next, let us discuss. And the monk looked back, the monks looked black. On the wall, the bench, the door, the monk looked black. Nay, quoth the prior, turn him out, do you say? In no wise lose a crow and catch a lark. What if at last we get our man of parts? We Carmelites like those Camaldolesi and preaching friars to do our church a fine and put the front of it that ought to be. And hereupon he bade me dwarf away. So what follows next is a description of how he introduces his own interest in the world of the monks. Fra Lippo Lippi accounts for the reaction of the monks towards his passion with a metaphor. The monks looked black. Obviously, he is not literally referring to the color. What he is trying to say is that the monks did not appreciate his artistic degradations and therefore he uses black because of its connotation, namely its allusion to being evil, bad, and angry. Nevertheless, the prior gave him permission to practice his passion, and Fra Lippo Lippi renders this in monologue by means of ellipsis, and hereupon he bade me dwarf away. So, in a spoken conversation, there would be no question of ellipsis because then it could be interpreted as the integral rendering of the order given by the prior. However, this is a dramatic monologue and thus a written version of spoken interaction. So, what he says next: what if at last we get our own purse? Okay. Thank you, my head being crammed, the walls a blank. Never was such prompt disemburdening. So, by inserting his answer to the prior's proposition, namely, he said, thank you. The conversation with the prior that took place some times ago becomes vivid. The word black is mentioned again to refer to the monks. We will see next. First, every sort of monk, the black and white. I drew them fat and lean, then folk at church, from good old gossips waiting to confess their creeds of barrel, droopings, candle ends, to the breathless fellow at the altar foot, fresh from his murder safe, and sitting there with the little children round him in a row of admiration, half of his braid beard and half for that white anger of his victim's son, shaking a fist at him with one fierce arm, sinking himself with the other because of Christ, whose sad face on the cross sees only this after the passion of 1,000 years. So let me analyze it. So the word black is mentioned again to refer to the monks. First, every sort of monk, the black and white. This may be interpreted both in a literal and in a figurative way. As for the figurative interpretation, it can be seen as an expansion of the metaphor in line 135, where Fra Lippo Lippi points out that the monks looked black. He is then making a distinction between the monks who supported his talents were white and those who did not were black. Nevertheless, his description of the monks goes further and he describes them as fat and lean. Since this accounts for a physical description of the monks, this makes us favor the literal interpretation of black and white. This way, the monk would refer to the physical appearance of the monks in the former line. His description of the people he painted goes on, and he mentions gossips, a murderer, his victim's son, children, and victim's sons, children, and a poor girl. So later on, he continues elaborating his arts. He says, till some poor girl her apron over her head, which the intense eyes looked through, came at Eve on tiptoe, said a word, dropped in a loaf, her pair of earrings, such a bunch of flowers, the brute took growling, prayed, and so was gone. I painted all, then cried, it is ask and have, choose for more's ready, laid the ladder flat, and showed my covered bit of cloister wall. When Fra Lippo Lippi is ready to show his paintings, then he reveals his covered bit of cloister wall. This expression is an understatement, since he did more than just covering up the wall. He decorated it with a beautiful painting, and thus may be seen as a form of false modesty on the part of the monk. At first, the other monks praise his work. Nevertheless, after taking a closer look, they do not really like what he painted. So, for the time being, let me end here. Soon. I'll be back soon to make the third part. Till then, thank you.